Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Breaking news from Kiev. I'm looking at the New York Times reporting that the European Union's foreign policy chief, Catherine Ashton, is looking for a new Ukrainian government, looking for a government that is stable in what remains of Ukraine's cohesive government, what remains in Kiev. There is right now a feeling that there's a simmering crisis, nothing exploding yet, but all parts of Ukraine are involved in what's next. Yanukovych, the elected president, has gone to the east and is unavailable or not speaking out after a brief television appearance in which he was defiant towards those who had either dislocated him or led him to flee. The European Union is involved. The United States is involved. Certainly Russia is, watching very carefully. And then there are other parliaments, other units in Ukraine that have authority in those regions, such as Crimea. All this is important to connect to see where we're headed in the possibility that a Central European state, Ukraine, 46 million people, could collapse into a failed state right in front of us. Professor Stephen Cohen of New York University, Russian history, is here. Stephen, I want to begin tonight with the story since last we spoke. Yanukovych was looking to sign a deal with the European Union, which he did last Friday. The Prime Minister of Germany was involved. That's the most important state. To look for monies to be transferred to Ukraine, perhaps up to $27 billion to meet its obligations. And then everything broke apart. How did we get to this moment tonight when they can't form a government? Good evening to you, Steve.
Well, let's punctuate the larger picture and then come back to Kiev, where they're trying to form a government. The larger picture is that de facto, at the moment, there are two governments of Ukraine. One is composed of the regional parliaments, Russia-leaning in the south and the east. People will know that that's where Crimea, that's where Odessa, that's where the naval base at Sevastopol is located. They'll know those names. Kiev, the capital of the country, is now in the hands of the protesters, the insurgents, the rebels, some would say mobs. And that parliament has been meeting nonstop, but it's a rump parliament. This is very important, that what was together the majority, the party of regions, that was the party of the elected and now deposed President Yanukovych, who has fled, and the Communist Party of Ukraine. They had a majority in the parliament. Those deputies are absent. They're afraid to go to the parliament because the parliament is being policed by very burly guys in black masks. That is, the tough guys from the street. So they fled, and you've got a rump parliament, a protesters' parliament. And they're proposing, if not passing, all sorts of bills that would, in effect, shut down the two formerly majority parties, ban Russian language as a local language, and all sorts of other policies that are aimed to discriminate or exclude Western and Southern Ukraine from Ukrainian politics. Meanwhile, in the south and the east, the Russian flag is popping up spontaneously. Russia's not doing this, above regional parliaments. And they are speaking of their affinity with Russia, not a desire to join Russia, but their affinity with Russia as opposed to Europe. So as we talk, we have two Ukrainian entities, governmental entities. Now, to go back to what you mentioned, in Kiev, in this parliament, they were supposed to form a government today, Tuesday. They're, I think, 8 hours earlier, and they didn't. And they said that they'd do this by Thursday. The problem is partly that even the protesters, which include moderates and extremists, whatever that might mean, but on their spectrum, that's what they are, don't agree among themselves. A second problem is some of their own leaders have been discredited during the last 3 weeks. But they need money from the West, from the European Union, Washington, and particularly the IMF. And the IMF is not going to give 5 or 15 or 20 or 30 billion dollars to a Ukrainian government whose composition it doesn't like. So it's a fair guess that they postponed the formation of a government for 48 hours so they could negotiate this among themselves, the people who control Kiev, and with the IMF. That's a reasonable guess.
We're looking now at announcements from London. All the European foreign ministers are involved in this decision because the European Union knows it must pool its resources. There's a shortage of money in Europe for bailing out troubled countries. Mr. Hague, the foreign minister in Great Britain, is planning to visit Kiev, I learned from the Daily Telegraph. And his quote, Steve, is, "This is a country, Ukraine, that needs financial assistance from many sources, including from Russia."
Yep.
Including from Russia. That means, Mr. Hague, and this is new to me, they think that the EU thinks that it can now go to Putin and say, help us, we're in a mess, we need your money too?
Well, I mean, look, think of the politics of it. Your listeners know that Europe is in economic crisis, and that some countries, such as Greece and others, are suffering terribly from these austerity
I'm told
policies.
that Poland and France have no money and that Mrs. Merkel is extremely tight-fisted.
Well, what would be the politics at home in European capitals if the European Union, which will not give bailout money to European countries, West European countries, suddenly coughs up $25 billion for Ukraine, for which ordinary people in Western Europe have no affinity whatsoever? And it's not only, was it the British Prime Minister who said that, but if you listen to what Susan Rice, Obama's national security advisor, said yesterday, after the usual anti-Russian statement, she said, but we have to work with Russia to save Ukraine.
That's what Mr. Hague is saying.
Yeah.
They've been blaming Russia, and now they want money from
Well, but you know what they have in mind. Remember that in December, before this crisis turned violent in the streets, before Yanukovych was toppled from office, before the country began to split into two countries, Ukraine was on the verge of default, and it had an offer from the European Union of 800 million euros. I don't know what that is in dollars, over $1 billion. It wasn't enough to get him through a week. Putin offered $15 billion by buying Ukrainian bonds, which are worthless, but more importantly, a one-third discount on natural gas shipped to Ukraine. That was worth billions, if not more, every 6 months. That was an enormous package, a kind of mini Marshall Plan. Yanukovych accepted it, the protesters protested it, and that's where we are today. So these Western so-called diplomats who have brought this on themselves now are saying to Putin, we have urinated politically all over you. We have made you the villain of this saga. But by the way, could we still have the $15 billion, which we don't want to give Ukraine, and we'll supplement it with some money? One can imagine Putin's reaction.
I'm told that Mr. Putin has remained calm throughout this, Steve, that the Kremlin is very confident. We'll discuss Mr. Putin and the candidate list for the new leader, the appointed leader in Kiev for Mr. Hague and other foreign ministers to visit. There's a long list, including Yulia Tymoshenko, you will recall, who has gone to Germany for medical attention, and I'm told to take care of her billions. Steve Cohen, Professor Steve Cohen of New York University, Russian history. This is the Kiev crisis, a Central European state failing. And part of that failure, and we'll speak of this, is neo-Nazis. I'm John Batchelor.